Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our Farm Biodiversity Markets update webinar. There's quite a bit to go through. I'm coming to you from Awabakal and Darkajing country, otherwise known as Lisro on the central coast of New South Wales. I know we've got people coming in from all around Australia. Um, so what I'm going to update in terms of markets is sort of four areas, and hopefully we can get through this pretty quickly. Um, what I'm not going to be talking about is the nature repair market, the state-based offsets markets, or natural capital accounting. We could explore those in the Q&A, but I think there's plenty of data available, both from the government, state, and federal, and that there are extension services around natural capital accounting that have been provided in most states. In New South Wales, there's dedicated natural capital advisors. Um, Instead, we're going to be talking about what we've seen with nature positive markets. So you will be aware, hopefully, that there was a global nature positive symposium held in Sydney only a couple of weeks ago. But what's been really driving this from the Regen Farmers Mutual's perspective is that um, there's a growing frustration that I'm hearing in the membership in the groups of farmers about, well, when are these biodiversity markets coming, Audie? What about rewarding for the good stewardship that we can do, are doing, have done? Um, Nature positive markets are, turning out to be quite different to, say, carbon markets, where some would argue that the way that they've been able to construct carbon markets has been able to be fungible by bringing everything down to a single ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. Whereas in biodiversity, there's a recognition that a tropical environment's different from a rangeland environment, which is different from a coastal environment. And so you've got these different environments, and in some cases, planting a tree might be the most appropriate thing to do, and in others, removing trees might be the most appropriate thing to do for the environment. It's not a one size fits all, and there's less fungibility. So there's a view that we're not actually creating markets for products, for commodities, for tradable items, but for services. Also coming through clearly around nature positive markets are global commitments by governments and by corporations. So the TNFD, uh, how that is going to be affected by the election of a US president. I think in the last 12 months, and maybe it was just the 12 months of this calendar year, something like 50% of the world's population were going to the polls. So there's a lot of political tumult and change at the moment, against a backdrop of where the public is becoming increasingly aware of biodiversity loss. And that is driving things like deforestation-free beef into Europe. So these policies and regulatory drivers that you're seeing are forcing us as producers of food and fiber to understand what sort of biodiversity is putting up, and nature positive means in terms of access to markets. And then lastly, in Australia, from the 1st of January 2025, we've got the rollout of the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. In the first year, this only applies to ASX listed companies or companies with $1 billion of revenue, and it only requires them in year one to do a scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions report, and at a 1.5 and a 2.5 degree threats analysis if the temperature changes by 1.5 and 2.5 degrees. But it's kind of pivotal sustainability reporting standards, even those basic ones, as the thin end of the wedge. So what's coming off the back of that, you could argue, is the whole gamut of ESG or CSR or SDG type reporting, where how a thing is produced, not just what it is produced, is going to be increasingly required to be disclosed. And directors are going to be fiduciarily responsible for that. So the biggest thing that's needed, for biodiversity markets, despite all those trends, despite all of that's going on, is we need to see, you know, three stages of a market develop. The first is the metrics, and we've already discussed how there's debate about the metrics. But then the thing that will catalyze things are the commitments or the legislation or the compulsion to act. We saw that with Australia and the other governments signing up to the IPCC around carbon, that set a 1.5-degree limit. And that was the compulsion. And in Europe, they are setting up carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And you can see it in the safeguard mechanism, which is compelling coal, oil, and gas and intensive industries to start buying carbon. Until such thing is in place in Australia, there isn't much compulsion for the biodiversity market, and therefore there isn't much market. So when I hear people talking markets for biodiversity and their level of frustration that they don't exist now, we're seeing that the true development of what you would consider a market, maybe comparable to the carbon market, is still 28, 29. It's still 3 or 4 years away. And so, our view of the world is that markets need to understand, and that we as custodians, stewards, owners of our land need to understand our biodiversity within a landscape context, and that we must understand that there's not just environmental markets at play, but there are multiple pools of capital at play. So when we're talking about biodiversity impacts on the farm, there is environmental markets. It's absolutely one of the 4 pools of capital. But probably there are other pools of capital, grants, both philanthropic and government, that have a real focus on public good. And there's the supply chain. So the sustainability reporting that's kicking in with that scope 1 and 2 this year, and 1.5 and 2.5 degree changes. You can see scope 3 being introduced in the following year, and you can see more and more biodiversity levers being put in. And you can see consumer awareness will really push supply chains to be probably faster acting than environmental markets when it comes to biodiversity. And then there's the local economy, the beyond the gate benefit, the provenance story of biodiversity, the ability to create new enterprises, have multiple land use, etc. So biodiversity on farm coming from markets, we still see as several years away before it's mature, and that it's only one of 4 pools of capital that in the landscape context you need to be really open to. One of the early and emerging kind of biodiversity markets, and Regen Farmers Mutual has been, kind of catalytic in this. So we're helping to create with ANU this boxgum grassy woodland certification credit. So it's a nature positive credit in that it's not an offset. It comes in 2 parts. There's a level for certification. So you can have bronze, silver, or gold certification. And then there's the levels within moving within bronze, or moving within silver, or moving within gold, improvement in habitat condition that can also generate credits. Now, there is a site assessment for certification, which is relatively easy to do, lower cost, and will enable, people with box gum grassy woodlands to be able to identify fairly quickly whether they're in bronze, silver, and gold. But in order to get changes of condition, you actually need to go and look into that habitat and see the health of that ecosystem. That can't be remote sensed. And it's probably, when you're talking about identification of the trees, most farmers or land care type professionals, locals, could be trained to do trees, but grasses, insects, birds, and other sorts of indicators of condition might require higher levels of skill or levels of qualification in order to do that assessment of change of condition. And that with those greater skills and time contribution for being on the ground come greater costs. And so whether somebody wants to engage in a nature positive credit and the associated costs with that will really be determined by the volume and the value of that market as it emerges in a couple of years' time. In the meantime, that certification provides the ability for farmers in particular to continue to get access and or premiums for proving their biodiversity potential. So I want to talk about examples of how this nature positive credit is currently working and conceived to work within the Trap Rock. So the Trap Rock is a region west of Stanthorpe, south of the Cunningham Highway, north of the New South Wales-Queensland border, and sort of east of Inglewood. It's a couple of 100,000 hectares with 180 to 250 farmers, depending on how you cut it. And you might not be familiar with this region, but it's called the Trap Rock and it's very undulating, hilly. And as a result, it wasn't extensively cleared with bulldozers and chains. However, it was cleared because particularly the box gum was growing in very fertile sort of toe slopes and enabled the best sort of grazing pastures. And so they have a lot of remnant box gum that couldn't be cleared, and they have the potential to regenerate and restore box gum in areas that have been cleared. So we're working with a bunch of farmers. 7 have registered for avoided clearing projects, another 7, so a total of 14, connect Sundown National Park and Pikes Creek, creating a biodiversity corridor of box gum grassy woodlands. That connectivity between the state park, the national park, and these 14 private landholders is unprecedented in terms of the habitat range that it's giving to woodland birds, to koalas and quolls. So it's creating a real sweet spot for the bird life. Now, of particular interest in that region, you've got Squadron Energy and Ashiona, who are 2 of the largest renewable energy, as in wind power. And we anticipate that they have to meet, biodiversity offset requirements that are legislated. And we don't think that that's going to be enough to maintain social license, because there's a general feeling that, if you're chopping down a tree and then you're protecting a tree, you've actually halved the estate of those trees. You actually need to protect and restore box gum grassy woodlands like what the trap rockers can do in order to have a nature positive effect. And so we see wind power buyers needing to do their offsets, but potentially being buyers of a nature positive credit in the same class of in order to have social license, in order to have a compelling story. Otherwise, they're just doing what they've always been done. The nature positive credit for box gum grassy woodlands can be used in the Southern Tablelands Agricultural Restoration Project, or the STAR project, which is another group that we've been working with. Now, this group are wheat, wool, beef, mixed farmers. They've got the ability and you've got to remember this, when they were given the blocks as a condition of settlement, was that you cleared this land. But they are in prime box gum grassy woodlands, areas that have been cleared for hundreds of years, changing, landscape rehydration, changing habitat mix. And what they have the opportunity to do, given the current carbon markets, plus this nature positive box gum grassy woodlands credit, is to actually plant carbon generating trees according to the ACCU scheme under the environmental mallee plantings or whatever replaces its method. You can plant in such a design that you can also restore box gum grassy woodlands with the requisite 14 mixed species of trees and grasses that are native rather. And that in doing so, you're creating not just a carbon forest, but a box gum grassy woodlands habitat. And that has the benefit of also generating better production. So what we found in the trap rock and what we found in the box gum in the southern tablelands is that there is this sweet spot of 20 to 30% coverage, which you need to be greater than 20% in order to get a carbon forest. But if you go more than 30%, often then you've got shading, impeded animal movement, and you've maybe lowering the overall productivity. But between 20 and 30% forest coverage of box gum grassy woodlands and native pastures, you're actually providing wind and shelter and a mixture of grasses that's good for lamb survival rates and calf survival rates, better quality milk, faster weight gain, lower emissions, a whole bunch of things that come from this. Now, when you're planting trees, you're locking up that land for 5 years while the trees establish. But once established, that land can be returned to productivity. It's no longer at that 20 to 30% being returned just to block bush that can't be grazed, can't be productive. It can stay part of a productive farm landscape whilst being box gum grassy woodlands habitat and a carbon forest. And you ask yourselves, well, over the landscape scale picture and over time, you could see farmers rolling out every 5 years new areas of appropriately spaced plantings that generate that design that enables them to get a carbon income, box gum grassy woodlands, nature positive credits, and a better productivity of farm. Now, the particular interest from that group of buyers for the nature positive claims are the supply chains for meat, beef, and lamb, but also wool. Wool, still a high fashion product coming out of Europe, and Europe's still one of the strongest legislators around nature positive and biodiversity markets. Okay, so in order to get into, you know, these markets for biodiversity, you are needing to look at the stacking. So carbon plus biodiversity, whether it's avoided clearing or plantings, making sense of the value that you can get. So we're seeing that nature stacks locally. On a farm, we talk about the carbon forest, the biodiversity benefit, the production benefit, the birds and the habitat, the small animals, the insects and the reptiles that are accruing there, and the increased hydrology. It all has this multiplier effect when it's growing in biodiversity. Likewise, it has a cascading effects, negative effects when you're degrading biodiversity. But in order to kind of understand where you fit for the nature repair market or where you'd fit for the box gum grassy woodlands nature positive credit, you only need log into planr.gov.au and draw a boundary around your farm and it will give you the condition score of your farm and its land management units relative to other land management units in your region and the national average. And that is 80%, 70% of the path towards your certification for a nature positive credit or the nature repair market, or if you were doing a carbon plus biodiversity project. Now, one of the smarts about that box gum grassy woodlands credit is that we're all built off the Australian Farm Biodiversity Certification Standard. It's a long set of words, but what it basically does is it says we recognize that a farm is made up of several land management units. You might have dams and riparian areas. You might have cleared grassland. You might have wooded grassland. You might have forest. You might have native forests. You might have different land management units. And for each of those land management units, it does an assessment score, and then it provides for a farm a weighted average of those assessment scores. And the reason it does that is they kind of want to avoid the greenwash of someone doing something good on 1% of their farm and then destroying the other 99% and being able to claim the value of the 1% for the entirety of the farm. And so Planner uses this land management unit and these weighted average measures to give you a biodiversity condition score. Now, what we're seeing is that the native woodland credit for boxgum grassy woodlands is just one kind of variation of that Australian Farm Biodiversity Certification Standard. But you could just as easily do one for farm dams or landscape rehydration or native animals or native birds. And you could be adding those credentials without a huge amount of expense and without replication. And so what you'd be able to do in time as a farmer, say in the southern tablelands, is restore a bunch of hectares with a carbon forest that grows boxgum grassy woodlands. But as a result of that boxgum grassy woodlands, you're getting native birds or native animals back, and then you're entitling yourself to the opportunity for new certifications and new crediting within those animal or specific species types. So Planner has learned some lessons compared to the CER. It is far easier to navigate Planner than it is the carbon portal in the CER. However, there is still, room for people to want to have their handheld. One of the most useful and experienced regen advisors in this space who's working with farmers in the Trap Rock and the Southern Tablelands is Kim Wilson. And she's been working directly with ANU on the actual standard for boxgum grassy woodlands certification and crediting. All right, let's talk the other pools of capital. So the TNFD, or the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, is all about pushing the same sort of regulations as you're seeing rolling out from January 1 next year around carbon into the role of fiduciary responsibilities of companies. But it's going to take time. But one of the things that they've done cleverly is that they've forced supply chains, instead of being able to use industry averages and individual data within their supply chain, which everybody has been arguing is too hard to do, they've said, well, you can just measure from within your supply shed versus your supply chain. And they talk to landscape specific outcomes being implemented as opposed to commodity specific outcomes. And that's really important because a beef producer in the Northern Territory versus the Southern production systems or one in a high rainfall or a winter or summer dominant rainfall. What those landscapes are individual and unique. They'll have different soils and veg types and habitats and communities and seasonality. And you know, as a result, we actually need the supply shed, and the TNFD is requiring them to actually report based on the sorts of commodities and where they're drawing those commodities from. So organizations, farmers, locals, if you want, need to understand how they can help describe their supply shed and help the farmers within that supply shed report to the various commodities that are pulling from those areas. Oops, I pressed the wrong button, but let me go back. Next button. So the other thing that's driving the traceability is, you know, everyone's fed up with greenwashing. Basically, there's like 60% of claims in the market have no data underlying them, and 40% of that 60% are outright fraudulent. And if everybody's making claims and none of them have any value, it's a complete race to the bottom. The UN CFAT has identified this as a problem of global trade significance. And so they've got this idea from the tech space that protocols, not technologies, are going to be the solution. So what I mean by technology is, you know, for a long time, people were arguing that, you know, if a supply chain can all just get on the one blockchain, then you can have traceability. But across long supply chains, and just looking at beef, where you take a cow, you disassemble it, it goes into Coles and Woolies, local butchers, export markets, and the trim goes somewhere else, gets processed, turned into other products and marketed. There's no way you're going to get a supply chain to all agree to use the same blockchain. And that when technology was faced with this problem for, say, websites or for email, what we came up with is protocols. So TCP is the protocol for sending emails. And now you can have Gmail and an Outlook, and they're totally different texts, but you can still send emails regardless of your tech stack. Websites are the same. And claims, they hope, will be the same, that claims will use a protocol to identify how the claim was calculated, who the claim was made by, that there is a claiming authority acting as a trust anchor who can verify that claim, and then that claim can be viewed and transferred using this protocol by anybody with the ability to view and see claims. And so that enables, you know, that very landscape specific regeneration of claims to be provided to the supply shed, in contrast to the, you know, great majority of funding, the great majority of commercial interest is coming from, you know, actors who are subject to TNFD or subject to SBTI commitments. And they're thinking within their silo, they're thinking, I produce wheat or a wheat derivative, or grain, or, you know, oil seeds or an oil seed derivative, or I do wool. They're not yet cottoned on to the point that they need to understand their supply shed within a landscape context, and that claims need to come from within that environment. Okay, an example of how RFM is using claims, and then we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A.
Hello, it's Cam Stewart here. I'm at Looking Glass in Highlands, Victoria. So the property is about 1,400 acres, about 550 hectares. It's a lot of granite and a lot of large granite rocks sitting underneath the surface. It's rolling hills with a lot of swamps, and there's a lot of springs and water that's generated on the property. We operate a Angus cattle herd, about 200 cows, and we produce about 190 calves each year. And we also have some wethers, about 400 fine wool wethers.
We face challenges here, as do all other farmers, with climate change. Also the flow-on effects towards sort of markets, in our case with beef cattle, and what is expected of farmers and whether they need to offset emissions from the cattle or not. We are focused very much on regenerative farming, trying to improve the microbial activity in the soils. That is not just for our cattle and our sheep, but also for the biodiversity in the area.
From an emissions perspective, we've done a number of baseline assessments. We did one with Regen Digital, very clear from those assessments that the vast majority of the emissions come from the methane from the cattle. So that's something that we are focused on. And in terms of trying to improve that, there's obviously improving the productivity of the cattle, but ultimately I think there will need to be some improvements in management of the methane and potentially carbon offset through sequestration and vegetation. For farmers who do take steps and are able to reduce their emissions, it seems fair that they get compensated. I think the market will go that way anyway, because I think that the market will be prepared to pay more for beef that is carbon neutral, and that will hopefully lead to farmers taking steps that can compensate them for that. We do think that traceability and having a connection through to the market is something that is really important and will grow in importance going forward. And we'd also been early adopters of Regen Digital. We thought it would be really interesting to work on a landscape type environment as opposed to just your own farm.
Well, our dream for this property is to leave it in better shape than we found it. And generally just like to turn up and find that it's a flourishing environment, both from a farming perspective and from a natural perspective as well, with just sort of nature and a farming business entwined.
So what you saw there was the ability for a landscape to aggregate claims from 7 producers in that G2G. And that helps them to verify the claims and put them in context of their landscape story and their farm story. And this also has the benefit of identifying, the desired actions to take within that landscape and what the funding, the ROI looks like when a supply chain invests in funding those sorts of outcomes that make most sense in that landscape. And then that landscape can prove those claims. So we're working with this supply shed strategy concept in the Granite to Goulburn idea. We would also like to, move outside of beef into cotton, cane, and grains in early 2025. But we think this will be a faster and probably a more material path to biodiversity markets and coincide with the legislated sort of markets that will develop. So where we are at the moment, and this is the update bit, I guess. In 2025, the World Economic Forum and the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures and the biodiversity metrics from what's his name, Lamborghini, who's been working on this on behalf of the WEF and on behalf of the COP process. He says that there will be that equivalent, and he calls it a formula, but let's call it metrics, released in January 2025. It follows that once there's the metrics or the formula, legislation and compulsion will enter into the markets, probably through Europe first. Asia, in fact, Japan has the highest number of SBTI complying organizations, will probably follow. Australia and America are likely to be global laggards in biodiversity, given where America's politics is at, and given Australia wants to be in lockstep with America more often than not. So I think we are yet to see the wash through of sustainability reporting standards in Australia. That will happen from 2025 onwards. We've got an election, which may well see Labor go to Liberal in our own election cycle. And, I wish I could help those farmers that are frustrated and wanting biodiversity markets now. But when you think of markets as a mechanism for price discovery and comparison, we are still immature. Okay, I flew through a lot of through a lot of content there, and I'm happy to revisit and give any detail to people if you're after some. May I ask, was there any questions? I literally got myself on screen and that's it at the moment. So if anybody is interested, happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. Just responding to Anna in the chat, who is asking a little bit about the Regen digital platform. So maybe you could tell people how to access that.
Oh, sure. Anna and everybody, if you go to regenfarmersmutual.com, it will put you on a list. Your state kind of determines when we can get to you. So if you're in Victoria, where we're all systems rolling, New South Wales and Queensland will be rolling out in the next couple of weeks. But if your name is on that list, then it's much easier for you to get first access. And that will give you your own digital twin using the Regen digital platform, and subsequently also give you membership of Regen Farmers Mutual. So what is the system that you're showing that is modeling the C+B via the dashboard? So the thing about the United Nations Transparency Protocol is because it's a protocol and a tech agnostic, all the claims that are made, whether they're with respect to carbon emissions or the biodiversity score that comes from Planner or wherever it comes from, they have to be made in a way that's human readable, but also machine readable as a JSON element. And so we just used an open source visualizing software called Metabase, and it reads the JSON file and just visualize those claims geographically, by kill date, by pick. And so anybody who's technically capable of organizing a JSON file could start reading claims. It's relatively easy to read claims. In order to generate claims, there's an open source standard that the UN has provided, and it would enable trust anchors to verify claims on behalf of those people that they are verifying. So Regen Farmers Mutual is a trust anchor for our members that enables us to have our members share with us important, maybe sensitive information, like say their tax return or their ENDVs or and then we can see from that tax return clearly the fuel, the fertilizer, the sales of livestock, etc. And we can be satisfied to verify the claim without you needing to then pass on your whole tax return all the way up the supply chain. The claim as it relates to scope 1, 2, 3, gross emissions, sequestration and net emissions, for example, can move up the supply chain. And if, needs be, it can be audited. But for the moment, it enables that trust anchor to say, yep, I've seen the underlying verified claim, and so I issue the verified claim. Now, for Regen Farmers Mutual, where our value proposition to members is that we have integrity, we're not going to let one claim go that, out of 100 where somebody is like being fraudulent, because it reduces the value of that claim and introduces greenwash to the other 99 members. So we do need to see the evidence that supports a claim in order to verify that claim. And that's been a sort of role that mutuals and co-ops have played for member organisations for years. In CBH, which is a large grain cooperative in Western Australia, does the ISCC certification for, grains going into Germany, International Sustainability Certification, ISCC. So, any other questions? I'm going to take it that there was too much information and everyone's a bit dumbfounded. Is anybody wanting to challenge the idea that we're still several years away from a biodiversity market? All right. We might all be getting an early mark. Roger, question.
Hey, Woody, thanks for the information. It's great. Yeah, some of the methodologies through the Clean Energy Regulator haven't been adapted in Australia yet, but there's international ones. Biochar standard is one that comes to mind. I know that there's a submission through Australia New Zealand Biochar for an Australian ACCU associated with that. The international biodiversity market, since it's going to be several years away, is that something that's worth pursuing or getting a toe in the water to think about, or is it just hold on?
I think the toes in the water are everywhere, from the nature positive credit for box gum to the nature repair market, to various natural capital accountings. There's a lot of toes in the water around biodiversity. What's not clear but is coming clear in January next year with the WEF auction and those metrics being released is, once you've got a metric or an algorithm, and the algorithm looks to be around number of hectares and condition of hectares, right, for a supply shed, then you'll have compulsion in markets, and then you'll have a market, but it goes in that order: metrics, mechanism, market. And what everybody refers to is just the market, but it's not clear to me whether, it'll be a CER regulated nature repair market, or whether it'll be supply chains driving sustainability reporting, and more like a nature positive credit. And still the biggest funders to date of biodiversity is that grants pool of capital around philanthropy and government. So all pools of capital have an interest in farm biodiversity. I just think that, the heavier regulated ones are going to be very concerned with greenwash, naturally, and don't want their system to be a failure. And when you're doing that, you're going to not focus on adoption. And we saw that with the carbon markets, the sorts of, regulation and legislation that are a carbon method. It took Christoph Burr to unpack avoided clearing, which is one of the easiest ones because you just don't chop down trees. But it became a 300-row decision tree once you'd gone through that. Now that leads to higher credibility, but it leads to lower adoption. And biodiversity that's done by government in that way, as opposed to market supply shed based biodiversity, they're going to be more interested in outcomes and impacts, I suspect, and measurable differences than they will be about the legislation and the bureaucracy and the methods. So how the world transpires, I'm yet to see. Yeah.
Good answer. Thanks.
Yeah. Adriana, you're bounding. Biodiversity metrics with sustainable and circular bioeconomies. Yeah, there is. Robin, there's a an increasing amount of interest in, for example, we've been talking with a large pharmaceutical company based in Europe who, I think I can say their name, AstraZeneca, yeah. And what they're interested in is carbon through forests, but the condition of their purchase is it's called a bioregional impact assessment, BIA. And what they're looking for is how that carbon project links to existing bioregionalism activities or can link into local energy production, local economic activities. And based on your BIA, there's a premium associated with that forest, and I assume the carbon. So you're starting to see some corporates link biodiversity with carbon. And when they're linking biodiversity, they're linking it bioregionally, which is bringing in local economics and local people. Another example, the Four Returns framework. The Landscape Finance Lab have worked hard on quantifying not just the environmental impact, but also the social, I think they call it inspiration capital, as well as the financial capital. So, yeah, there's lots going on there. Hey, Sam, if the biodiversity market is implemented by the Australian government, is there any hope that a normal person will be able to navigate it? Look, that planner website is a heck of a lot easier to navigate than the CER portal. But still, I find a lot of people just want the confidence of somebody sitting either virtually or physically with them, or doing it as a group of 10 or so, and going through the process of let's identify our area, let's draw a map around our farm boundary, let's get our biodiversity condition score, let's compare that to others' biodiversity condition scores. What are the things that we'd like to do next, and doing that as a group, that tends to be, the best way to work, and the way that most farmers seem most comfortable working. So when we've spoken recently with the tech developers of Planner, they're like, theoretically, a farmer could, register for a nature repair market method, follow the project methodologies, cost the project in advance, have all the reporting functions to report on the delivery of the project. But no farmers have that skill set and capacity to time, and time to be self-service with it. And so they understand they no longer have a technical impediment, they have a social impediment. So that's really exciting to see. But I think, generally speaking, you want to be part of a group, or you want to have a person on your shoulder as a farmer to help you guide you through these sorts of market mechanisms. Michelle said, how changes to biodiversity to be measured? You may be able to count the number of koalas, but what about soil microbial activity? Transaction costs by farm would be enormous. Then how on earth do you price in changes of biodiversity? Noting that, yeah, look, the smaller you go, the harder it is to observe. Easily the best biodiversity measure to measure is extent, because you can see, is there new hectares of box gum grassy woodlands from point A to point B? Harder is the condition of that extent. Is it barely qualifying as box gum grassy woodlands, or is it pristine? And knowing the difference over time and how it reacts to local water, like how wet has it been in the preceding couple of years, is going to have a big difference to the health of that box gum compared to composition of species. And then, yeah, when you start getting into soil microbial biodiversity, the granularity of that is so small that it's unlikely to be the first thing that's measured. And the last thing that, if you take it as measure mechanism, then market, soil biodiversity is going to be a long way before it's measured, let alone they find the mechanism and then the market. So hopefully that helps. The smaller, the harder and more expensive, and the longer it'll take to emerge as a market.
Wardy, I have a question. I was talking to a farmer the other day who, I think it's through the New South Wales government, has put a number of acres, I think it's quite extensive, of grassy woodlands fenced off for biodiversity purposes. But they're cattle graziers and very much into holistic grazing. And the younger son is starting to question the commitment because it doesn't allow him to graze it once a year or every couple of years. Those certification levels you were talking about before in terms of gold, bronze, and silver.
Yep.
Would it be considered, do you think, double counting if they wanted to engage in an initiative like that, that if there was flexibility allowed in their original biodiversity agreement to be able to measure the existing biodiversity at play currently versus that over a 5-year time frame, if they could then actively graze it and do sort of water hydration works and that sort of stuff? Do you think that'd be considered double counting to be able to engage in both initiatives?
Well, it depends. Like what you're sort of describing is a biodiversity offset that might be on covenant, particularly if it's restricted grazing, for example.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the details, which would probably help my question to you a lot. But I was just thinking about there'd be many people that already have existing covenants that maybe their knowledge of landscapes is changing. And so rather than it being a simple offset conservation sort of covenant, could it become more of a holistic engagement?
That'll be a matter at a state by state basis for each of but certainly Victoria and New South Wales, they're quite progressive. Trust for Nature, for example, is looking at sustainable agricultural covenants as opposed to just protection covenants. BC is looking at stewardship agreements instead of just permanent protection. And so there are ways, and as a mutual, we're owned by farmers. We've got a principal interest in food and fibre production. So any market mechanism that's taking active management away and locking it up and permanently protecting it, we're less inclined towards than we are to getting that mix between what's good for the environment and good economically and doing more of that and getting the pools of capital to support that, right? And that can be different in the Trap Rock to the Southern Tablelands. But we would look at those sorts of actively managed areas and how we get the best for nature and economics out of that than we would be at how do we help people that have put their land in permanent protection with a state body to get more flexibility over their land management agreement.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the reality of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions or concerns about the market? Anybody got more up-to-date information than me and feels that, biodiversity markets are just a couple of months away as opposed to a couple of years away? Okay. I did have one response when we kind of talked this through with a bunch of the farmers in person at the Trap Rock, and we walked through the nature positive credit and, how you'd go through it. And he said, I'm so excited. I've had my expectations squashed. But what it meant was farther than biodiversity being this, thing that people have talked about that we haven't got standards for. Now we're starting to get to the point where you can get a biodiversity condition report. You can certify your state of being and when it's economic to do so, get credited for that improvement over time. And so now there is like a scientifically rigorous, government endorsed, stackable, nature positive credit. I think that's a huge step for biodiversity markets. or for biodiversity mechanisms. And the fact that it's so aligned with supply shed reporting, which is what all the commodity houses and all of the FMCG, fast moving consumer goods, food and fiber buyers are ultimately going to have to report into. I think we're starting to find mechanisms that are going to be market friendly and timely and you know, survive the whim of governments, etc. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? You'll get an early mark then. 3 minutes early. Thank you for attending. Yes, I'll share the video of this presentation. I look forward to seeing you all in person or on another webinar soon. Thank you.